Welcome to the Even Better podcast, where your host, Sinikka Waugh of Your Clear Next Step, brings you exciting content about making communities better by helping people get even better at work.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining in to the Even Better podcast. This is Sinikka Waugh with Your Clear Next Step, and I am just thrilled to be here. We've got a creative topic this morning, so I'm delighted to introduce you to Creative David Doob-chak, who is a teacher here in Indianola, where my kids go to school. So that's how I met David over the years, and I have just been really delighted to understand his passion for creative thinking. And we're going to visit with David a little bit today about unlocking your genius mode. For our listeners, to let you know a little bit more about him, he is, in addition to his work in the school district, where he has just helps teachers and he helps students unlock their creative ideas, he has also written a book called Activate Your Genius Mode and the new Genius Mode School Edition. So you get some of these follow-up information. You can reach out to us at Your Clear Next Step, and we'll get you in touch with David to follow up on those. You can also find him online, and we'll let him share that information as well. He's also, just in case you weren't quite intimidated yet, David is also an award-winning producer and playwright, and his video productions have won several awards with organizations such as the Iowa Motion Picture Association, Broadway World, and the Festigious International Film Festival, Los Angeles. So great things about David. He got his Bachelor of Science and Education at Drake and his Master of Education in Curriculum and Instructional Technology at Iowa State. He delights in speaking and holding workshops on creativity and on productive failure. And I'm intrigued by that idea of productive failure. But David, thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
This is just really, really fun. So in addition to all of the things that you do, right, teaching and inspiring and writing, and now you have also you've launched this business of your own. And so we're engaging you. You're working on conversations around coaching and coaching creativity and teaching people how to do this. So this is just a wonderful opportunity to engage and understand a little bit better. The topic that we've selected for today is 4 ways to activate the genius modes for you and your workforce. So I'm so intrigued by this genius mode. So before we get any further in this, David, introduce us to the idea of genius. What are we talking about here?
All right. Well, a lot of times when we think about geniuses, we think about people like Albert Einstein or Mozart, or, maybe more contemporary, we have Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, those people we consider to be geniuses. But what I look at is that oftentimes, those people we consider to be geniuses are really just 2 or 3 people every 100 years that come around and they make these world-changing revolutions. But in a world where we have big problems, important problems, and they're not unsolvable, but they might take solutions no one's thought of yet, 2 or 3 people every 100 years isn't enough to do that. And so really, in reality, I think everybody has this genius mode that by learning creative thinking habits and skills, we can activate. And that's what I do, is I try to teach people these creative thinking skills, these creative thinking habits, so that they can think like geniuses in their everyday life or in their workplace or out in the world.
Awesome. So when, David, when you and I first encountered each other, you were a computer sciences teacher at the middle school. And while absolutely, when I think about computer science and I think about the folks that I know in that space, the genius part is totally that's lockstep. I get it. There are brilliant, brilliant minds in that space. And then you started talking about this idea of creativity. And I went, well, now that's interesting. That's a cool new twist. So I love the idea here, the bringing together the truth of creativity doesn't have to necessarily, clearly you've got a space in the performing arts and in the written arts, but in technology as well. Creativity is not bound to just canvas and the stage, right?
Exactly. When I talk about what exactly is a genius, what most academics would talk about is really just the ability to make connections or to make new things that are new or unseen or not seen quite that way in our social context, right? And so kind of to demonstrate this, NASA, in the 1960s, NASA developed a test where they were trying to find geniuses for their workforce, right? Because obviously, NASA needs these geniuses. And on this test, they administered it to adults, and they found about 2% of the adults that they gave this test to were identified as geniuses. Just the ability to come up with new ideas, new ways of doing things. But then they gave the same test to 4 and 5-year-olds, and 94% of those 4 and 5-year-olds were identified as geniuses on the same test, right? So genius is the ability to look at things in new ways and find new solutions to problems. That's what a genius is. And really, that's creative thinking skills. And so when you look at those 4 and 5-year-olds, yeah, when we're asking them questions, they're thinking of creative things that they're not limited by their knowledge or their experiences, because they don't have that knowledge and experience. So they're just going in all kinds of different directions and coming up with new things. And that's how they were identified as geniuses on this test.
Oh, outstanding. And if our mission here at Your Clear Next Step is to help people have better work days so that they can co-create better environments, then certainly we would want to unleash that creative potential, that genius mode to help us solve the problems that are in front of us, to help us make connections in new ways. Wow.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can look at this very practically too in a workplace. So in just one very powerful story is the story of Orange County, California. This was back in the early 2000s. They had a $3.5 million budget shortfall. And they wanted to be able to solve that without cutting $3.5 million worth of salaried positions. And so they hired some creative psychologists to go in and just give a couple of half-day creative thinking seminars to their employees. And within a year, the number of new ideas presented from employees to managers increased by 55%. And they found ways to cut that $3.5 million worth of expenses and raise over $600,000 in new revenues without cutting very many salaried positions, and that's that genius type thinking that helped them solve those problems.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. Okay. So how do we activate it? How do we tap into this for ourselves and for our workforce?
Okay. I have 4 ways to activate your genius mode. So way number 1 is just let's recognize what creativity is. All right. So you mentioned earlier when I was teaching computer science, and you said, okay, creativity can be more than just the canvas and the arts, right? So oftentimes people do confuse creativity with artistry. Okay. They say Walt Disney was creative, Mozart was creative, Picasso was creative. I'm more of a numbers person. Okay. That's what people often think of with creativity. But, that leads people to the misconception that I'm not very creative. And the academic definition of creativity is the ability to generate solutions that are novel and appropriate. Novel and appropriate. So novel meaning new, not seen before, not seen in this way, in this context, okay? Novel meaning new, and appropriate meaning it actually does solve the problem that I have. And so creativity can be artistry. That problem can be an entertainment problem, an artistic problem, right? But when we go into the workplace, we have very real problems in our workplace that can be solved with creative thinking skills. So creativity isn't necessarily artistry. Creativity is the ability to come up with solutions that are novel and appropriate.
That's really interesting. I'm going to pause you for a second there, because as you described that, I went back to one of my favorite analogies from theater, which I use, or from the movies, I guess, that I also use in my business analysis training and my project management training, which is the Karate Kid example, right? The paint the fence and the wax on, wax off, and the skills that the young student is learning outside of context then get applied in a different context. So it's novel for the situation, right? That movement of wax on, wax off is novel for the situation to help provide that skill. So it doesn't have to be novel as in brand new, invented, never been thought of, but novel for the situation, and then appropriate, I think was the other word you used.
Yeah, exactly. And this is another thing that leads to the misconception of some people are creative, some people aren't, is because psychologists differentiate this with big C and little c creativity. And so that big C creativity, those are your famous world-changing types of creative people, okay? Your Walt Disney, your Mozart, your Elon Musks, that's big C creativity. But technically big C creativity is having influence across multiple domains, all right, and gaining widespread recognition for doing so. But then little c creativity is more personally meaningful creativity. All right. So if I develop a creative solution to something that really it's creative to me, but if I introduce it to the whole world, it might not necessarily be creative to the whole world. That's still a creative thinking skill, okay? If it's something I've never encountered before, and I use creative thinking skills to come up with it, that's still creative thinking. And what happens is people are working at the little c level, but then they compare what they do to the accomplishments of the big C creatives.
Okay.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
So if I paint a landscape of some kind, right? And I'm a novel artist, I'm doing this for my enjoyment. I paint a landscape and I'm kind of proud of this. And then someone says, that's a pretty good landscape, but you should check out Monet. You should really check out Monet, right? He does some really creative stuff. Okay. That could lead me to think I'm not creative. Okay. So we need to recognize our own little c creativity. When we're coming up with novel and appropriate solutions, even just to us, is still creative.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. I wonder how often we steer people towards that idea of, oh, I'm not creative because the thing that I've produced isn't as pretty or as exciting or as masterful as perhaps someone that has done something, and that is their natural inclination or their natural area of expertise.
Exactly. Yep.
So random light bulb moments. What about the, aha, is that creativity?
Creativity can happen with these just random light bulb moments, but creativity isn't necessarily just a random process. Creativity can be a learned, intentional process. All right. At its very basic level, it's cycles of divergent and convergent thinking. So divergent thinking means we're going out in many different directions, coming up with many different ideas. And after we've done that, then we converge on which of the ideas are good, which ones are useful, what can we build on for the future. All right, so we can start from just that very basic nugget and make it even more of a process with even more tools that we utilize. But at its very basic structure, it's cycles of divergent and convergent thinking. And so, yeah, those light bulb moments do happen. All right, but if I'm faced with a problem and I need to generate solutions to it, learning how to do that divergent and convergent thinking can help us come up with creative solutions intentionally.
And not just to stumble on them. Okay.
Exactly.
So, and I've heard you talk about a creativity formula before. What is that?
All right. So the creativity formula is something that I developed to be able to explain what do we need in our environment, either our personal life or our workplace, but what do we need in our environment and in our everyday practices to think and act in creative ways. And so that creativity formula is creativity equals psychological safety plus curiosity plus divergent thinking. So by keeping all three of those things on the forefront of our minds and acting on them to make sure we have an environment of psychological safety, we are regularly practicing curiosity, we're regularly practicing divergent thinking. That's how we become more creative, and that's how we start to think like geniuses.
Very cool. Okay, so as we expand on this, and we're going to take each one of those apart, I think, with your 4 ways to tap into, your 4 ways to unlock your genius, really recognizing what creativity is. That's the first one. Okay, so let's go on to that second one, because I suspect some of our listeners already have a question about it. Okay, what do you mean? What's that second one?
All right, so number 2 is to ensure psychological safety. All right, so I want to start out with the misconception. The misconception is that creative people can just be creative whenever. So if you're my manager and I'm the creative person and you're like, okay, I need ideas, boom. We think that creative people can just be creative whenever. But that's not necessarily the case. Creative people really do need the right type of environment in which to be creative. And we do that by promoting psychological safety. So the definition of psychological safety that I use is the ability to freely give ideas and risk failure without the fear of punishment or reprimand. That's what I consider to be psychological safety. So, for example, I really like the Geico and Progressive insurance commercials. Have you, seen those kind of wacky commercials online?
You bet.
The one I am really in love with right now is the Unbecoming Your Parents commercial. Have you seen that?
I haven't seen that one.
there's like this, it's a therapist who is teaching middle-aged people how to not be their parents. It's awesome. You know, I say if that's your favorite commercial, you must be in your 30s, and I'm in my 30s because I, especially during the pandemic, have seen myself becoming my parents in very strange ways. But anyway, I love that commercial. But it's a Progressive insurance commercial. So it's a very creative, unique commercial that gets a lot of attention. But imagine if the person who wrote it took it to their manager, and their manager turned around and said, "What does this have to do with insurance?"
Mm.
Right?
Yep.
And that's how we wind up with just regular, boring, average commercials that don't make an impact.
Yep.
Okay? So if the person who writes these has the ability to come up with these creative ideas and then explore and expand on them, that's when creative ideas happen. So the ability to freely give ideas and risk failure without the fear of punishment or reprimand.
Mm. So in our organization, one of our core values is that we refuse to say that's the way it's always been, right? That's the way we've always done it. We refuse to accept that as an okay reason for anything. But then that leaves us wondering, okay, well, what do we? Okay, what we've done is what we know. How do we think outside that box? So I'm really intrigued by these ideas of unlocking that creativity, unlocking that genius within.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about that when I get to point number 4, which is the divergent thinking. You know, how the way we've always done things can be one of our biggest impediments to creativity. But, you know, I kind of understand why, you know, say this commercial's being written and the person says, what does this have to do with insurance? Because nobody wants bad ideas to be implemented. And so how do we stop bad ideas from being implemented while still allowing for the free exchange of ideas? And so I have a couple of tools here that I talk about both in my books and my workshops. The first one is a tool called POPIT. It's an acronym, POPIT. It stands for pluses, opportunities, problems, inquiries, and new thinking.
Okay.
So somebody gives an idea, and as you're giving feedback on this idea, you can do it through the perspective of POPIT. First, we look for the pluses. Whenever an idea is given, we first try to look for what's good about it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so every new idea, start with what's good about it. The pluses, what are the good things about it? And then the opportunities. What new opportunities can this create for us? Then we talk about our problems.
Yep.
Okay, what's the problem with the idea? But then the key next thing is the inquiries, where we turn those problems into possibility statements, right? So if one of the problems is this is too expensive, then let's flip that. How can we make it less expensive?
Mm-hmm.
If the problem is this doesn't have anything to do with insurance, then the inquiry is how do we relate this to insurance?
Yep.
Right? So turn your problems into possibility statements. And then that new thinking is what new ideas do we come up with based off those inquiry statements?
Nice. It's really, I want our listeners to pause for a second and embrace this reality that there's method here. There's methodology. There's a process, which I think you alluded to earlier, that it's not just a random spontaneous influx of creativity. There's a methodology that fosters that.
Exactly. Yep. And so, yeah, when I say psychological safety, the ability to freely give ideas, risk failure without fear of punishment or reprimand. When we don't have that, if this is something that happens all the time. Someone gives an idea, someone else immediately says, no, that's not a good idea. No, we can't do that because here's why. No, we tried that 20 years ago and it didn't work.
Yep.
Right? If every time someone gives an idea and you're shot down, if people say your ideas are bad, you're never given an opportunity to follow through on them, you're just not going to give ideas. That's the way it works. You're just not going to speak out. And so creative thinking really requires the freedom to speak out. And not all ideas are good, but let's turn weak ideas into good ideas.
Yep. Well, and I think I've heard you mention an idea of embracing failure and in that making psychological safety. So I recall hearing a keynote speaker once talk about the idea of fail faster. So it's okay to fail. It's okay to not get it right. Just do it faster so you pick yourself up and keep moving. How does that play into psychological safety?
Okay. So especially when we're trying to solve problems or come up with new ideas, whenever we do something the first time, it might not work, right? I talk about the company SpaceX a lot. SpaceX they build rockets Their big innovation was they were able to build rockets that can land and be reused, which, believe it or not, something we've never been able to do in the history of rocket science. All right, so we started launching spacecraft in the 1950s. It wasn't until 2015 that we were able to reuse the rockets. But by my count, SpaceX blew up 18 rockets on the way to being able to land and reuse them, right? But every single one of those attempts was a way of saying, okay, we don't know what we're doing yet, but every time we do this, we're going to get closer and we're going to learn what to do the next time. So yeah, I mean, there was one of them, they thought they had the system completely worked out. The rocket came to land and it smashed into the landing pad. And what happened? Well, there were fins that steer it that ran out of hydraulic fluid because of the way the system was designed. So then they had to go redesign the hydraulic fluid system, and that way it could steer itself to the landing pad more effectively. But the key there is not only was failure tolerated, it was expected. Okay, they knew they weren't going to be successful yet, but their intent was to learn for the next thing.
So for our listeners who are part of organizational cultures, really fostering that sense of safety, that it's okay to not get it perfect. Perfection is a direction, never a destination. It's okay to learn from our failures. It's okay to learn from our mistakes, or to take a page from Edison and his 1,000 ways not to build a light bulb, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I got it there. So we started with really recognizing, first point was recognizing what creativity really is. And then you've talked to us, point number 2 is about ensuring psychological safety. So for our listeners, let's get on to a third way to make sure we can tap into that creative genius.
Okay, so number 3 is to cultivate curiosity. All right, so that's the second part of the creativity formula, psychological safety plus curiosity. Curiosity is the ability to notice things and to make connections. And it's those connections that help us think of creative things. So curiosity really primes our minds to ask questions and to make those connections. I mean, think of a toddler who's like, but why? But why? But why? Right? You know, if we can cultivate that ability within ourselves to say, yeah, but why? That will lead us on a journey to being able to come up with creative things. I mean, that's how the Polaroid camera was invented.
Really?
Okay. Yeah, there was a photographer who was on an all-day-long photography adventure with his 4 or 5-year-old daughter, and at the end of the day, he said, okay, now we have to wait till tomorrow to see what our pictures look like. And his 4 or 5-year-old daughter's like, yeah, but why? Okay, and that's what led to the Polaroid instant camera. She didn't give him the answer, but it was the right question that led to it. So that's the power of curiosity. But I also like to say that curious people like to ask questions.
Okay.
But in the workplace, that important question, they don't just ask, how can we do things better? They ask, how can we do better things? And it's those better things that lead to a really exciting, innovative workplace.
Nice.
And so when I say that curiosity, being curious and training ourselves to be curious primes ourselves to ask questions and make connections. My favorite story with that is the story of Bill Bowerman. He is one of the co-founders of Nike. And in the 1970s, they were having a problem because the track shoes that all the athletes wore had metal cleats on the bottom, the metal spikes. And colleges were starting to install synthetic track surfaces. And they couldn't use the metal cleats because the metal cleats were tearing up the surface. So he's like, okay, you know, what do we do about this? And so that was in the back of his mind. Psychologists, we would call this the incubation phase, where cycles of we're thinking about it, actively working on it, and sometimes it's in the back of our mind. It's incubating. And so he was thinking about this, and one morning, his wife was making waffles for breakfast. And as he was eating the waffle, he looked at the texture of the waffle and made a connection between that texture and something that could grip the track surface. And the story goes, he runs into his garage, mixes up a urethane mixture, pours it directly into the waffle iron. And after several months of tinkering, they released the Nike waffle trainer, which was a track shoe with a waffle pattern on the bottom.
Nice.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very cool. So can we, the workforce who are listening to this podcast, is there something we can do to cultivate our own curiosity or cultivate curiosity in those around us?
Absolutely. And it's that curiosity. By doing this, we will prime ourselves to ask those questions and make those connections. So from the very most simple idea here is ask people, what have you been curious about?
Mm.
I do that when I'm teaching all the time. I have a daily warm-up question, and once a week or every other week, that's the question. What have you been curious about lately? But maybe managers asking their employees or our workforce asking that of each other, just by paying attention to what we've been curious about, that does help make us more curious. Another thing I like to do too is having managers encourage and model frequent questioning. And we can do that through an exercise that I did with a class I taught just the other day. We had a 20-minute conversation. I had them pull up an object from their house or a picture on their phone and something they could talk about for 20 minutes. And I put people in pairs and just had them ask questions of one another for 20 minutes. A topic that they didn't know anything about, So that's one way to do it. Find somebody with an expertise that you don't have and ask questions about it. These are all things that'll help us increase our curiosity.
That's interesting, David, because I think about some people are hardwired to ask more questions, right? They're inquisitive, they are question askers, they want all the data. Somewhere along our corporate cultures, there has been sometimes a tendency to shut down questions, stop asking questions. That's out of your lane, or that's above your pay grade, or I'll worry about that, don't you worry about that. And listening to you describe this, I can point to moments where I've seen creativity or curiosity at least sort of squelched a little when people aren't allowed to ask questions. So certainly we as employees, as leaders, as colleagues, as co-workers and co-creators of great environments, if we're asking questions and encouraging that among others, we can help cultivate curiosity.
Yeah, exactly. I don't have time to go into the full story right now with this podcast, but if listeners want to do a little more research, look into the story of Apollo 12, okay? Apollo 12 was the second manned moon landing. It was struck by lightning 1 minute into launch. And the only reason that mission was saved and not aborted was because of a very curious mission control flight director who, at a training mission he wasn't supposed to be at a year earlier, noticed something wrong. And that led to just a personal investigation on his part. And what the knowledge he gained from that saved Apollo 12, and they went on to land on the moon. So yeah, if you have a chance, go look into that story.
Oh, super cool. Super cool. Okay,
Yep.
So we gotta keep an eye on the clock here.
Right. Yep.
This is fascinating. I'm just delighting in this conversation.
Yeah.
So we can talk about four ways to sort of unlock or understand that creative genius. And the first one was really understanding what creativity is. And then second, you wanted to make sure that we ensure psychological safety, because we need to have that psychological safety to be creative. And then we talked about your third point, which was cultivate curiosity. So let's ask those questions. Let's get to the fourth point. What's your fourth way?
All right, the number 4 is practice divergent thinking. So the word diverge literally means to go out, okay? And converge means come together. So here's what I see happen a lot is I see people trying to diverge and converge at the same time, okay? Come up with an idea and then figure out if it's good. Come up with an idea, then figure out if it's good. But really what we're trying to do is come up with a lot of ideas, many more than we could ever use, build on them, let them go in unique directions, and then decide whether or not they're good. And that's called reserving judgment. Okay. So someone gives an idea, you don't get to talk about whether it's a good idea or not yet. Every idea you have is worth talking about. All right. And to kind of illustrate this, I call it the third 1/3 phenomenon. So if I'm working with you on a creative problem solving session and we have a big enough group, I might challenge the group to come up with 300 ideas to solving a problem. All right, I was doing this with a group the other day, and we were kind of working, we were virtual, we were online, we had a whiteboard with sticky notes online, and as we worked, we were moving from the left to the right of this board. And our first 100 ideas, we came up with 100 ideas in 5 minutes, okay? Those are your not unique creative ideas, all right? But then I did different tools and techniques to build on them and improve them and come up with 300 ideas, and then I let everybody vote for their favorite ideas to move on in the next step. And the interesting thing is, it was really clear to see on my board, left, center, and right. And the ones on the right were the hardest to come up with. But when I let everyone vote for their favorite, all of the ones people voted for were on the right side of the board.
Nice.
Yeah. So that's what happens when you reserve judgment and you go in many different directions.
Yeah. And you just alluded to more of that disciplined methodology. It's not, and this is why I suspect this is why you've gotten into the business of offering workshops and training on this. It's not just naturally sit down and make a list. There's process to it. There's methodology to helping you take the first 100 ideas, if you will, and then go into your next 100 and then your third 100, which is where the really cool ones might be found.
Exactly. Yeah. That third 1/3 is the hardest to come up with, but those are where your creative ideas are going to be. And when we're trying to do divergent thinking, our biggest problem is something called a knowledge constraint, which is your existing knowledge on a topic.
Mhm.
So if you ask me to design a new car, the car I give you is probably going to be very similar to an existing car. It's going to have 4 tires, going to have a steering wheel, going to have seats, because in my mind, that's what a car is.
Mhm.
Where if I ask somebody who's never seen a car, never used a car before to come up with one, that might be completely different.
Okay.
Okay? The way we do things, as we mentioned earlier, is our biggest limiter to coming up with creative ideas.
Mm.
And so this story is one of my favorite stories ever. A jazz piano player named Keith Jarrett. In the 1970s, he was giving a charity concert. This charity concert was organized by a 17-year-old high school student, and he's this legendary jazz piano player. But in his contract, they specified the type of piano he had to have, specified the brand, full grand piano, and all of, specified everything.
Okay.
So he gets to the concert venue, and there was a mix-up, and the piano didn't get there, and all they had was this old rinky-dink baby grand rehearsal piano. And it wasn't in tune. The upper registers were tinny, the lower registers were worn out, the sustain pedal didn't work, and it's not loud enough because it's not a full grand. And so he storms out, refuses to play, and this 17-year-old girl who organized it follows him to his car, knocks on his window, begs and pleads with him, please come and play, and after a while convinces him to do it. So the technicians do the best they can with this piano. They get it somewhat in tune, but still, sustain pedal doesn't work. Lower registers are worn out, upper registers are tinny. And his managers recorded it for cautionary purposes. They wanted an example to give to people to say, this is what happens when you don't give Keith Jarrett the right piano.
Yep.
But here's what happened in the concert. He had to not just work around the limitations of the piano, but he used the limitations of the piano as something to build off of.
Mm-hmm.
And critics would go on to say that this was his best ever concert. And the album they created became, still today, the best-selling jazz piano album of all time. Because he was forced to not work the way he had always worked.
Yep. What a great cautionary tale. What a great
Mm-hmm.
lesson for all of us to really take to heart. Your point, forced to, right? There, we
Mm-hmm.
tend to not want to get out of our boxes, right? We can say we want to think
Exactly.
more creatively, or we want to unlock that genius, but we also really like our boxes, right? We like
Exactly.
I like what's familiar. I like the space that's around me, and this is what I know how to do, and this is what has worked for us in the past. We're afraid of failing. We're afraid of taking too long. We're afraid of all of these other things. And when there's a constraint, like the beautiful piano example, when there's a constraint that requires of us, that demands of us to do things differently, then I suspect we really do rise to the occasion.
Yeah. And so just a couple of real quick tools here that I like to force us to think outside of that box, think outside the way we do things. When I'm trying to do divergent thinking, the first thing, a silly warm-up question, silly open-ended question. How can your organization benefit from a donation of 1 million ping pong balls? Or a donation of 1,000 left-handed gloves? Okay? Something with no right answer. Come up with as many ideas as we can. One of the rules of divergent thinking is quantity over quality.
Mm-hmm.
The next thing I like is a word web. So you start out with a word that represents your problem, and then you kind of go off, what are variations of that word? But then we say, okay, 10 variations of that word, and then I pick one of those and do 10 variations of that, and then pick one of those and do 10 variations of that, and now we're in unique creative thinking territory. Okay. Another one is word dance. So you take a challenge statement, and then you find synonyms for some of your keywords. So how can we get new clients? Well, synonyms for get. How can we recruit new clients? How can we find new clients? How can we entice new clients? How can we gather new clients or clients? People, let's see, managers, or retirees or things like that, right?
Yeah.
And by finding all those synonyms, then that leads us into more creative territory, or at least spurs new ideas, helps us get to that third one-third.
Yep. And creating that environment, I'm going to go back to your second point about the psychological safety, because creating that environment where you can say silly things, creating that environment where
Exactly.
you can say something non sequitur or that would be outlandish under regular
Mhm.
circumstances. It may not be the answer that you land on, but it allowed you then to get to the one that you did land on.
Exactly. I like to say it's easier to tame a wild idea than invigorate a weak one.
Amen.
Yeah.
Again,
And
that's
so,
a great quote.
yeah. And so create this environment where, yeah, we need to seek the wild and unusual. And that might not be the idea we go with at the end, but it gives us something to work with to get into the creative territory. And we have to be allowed to do that.
You bet. You bet. So we've got thinking about the cultivating curiosity and the divergent thinking and the psychological safety. A theme that all three of those have in common is a willing suspension of judgment.
Mm-hmm.
That's really that's something that I try to live and model and teach in all of our classes, is the suspension of judgment. Let's not judge. And in this very structured way of being more creative, we can do that by suspending that judgment, by making it safe, by allowing people to ask questions and to be curious, and then allowing us to have even outlandish ideas so that we can move forward to great ones.
Exactly. And that kind of helps us wrap it up, that by practicing that regularly, by understanding what it looks like and practicing it regularly, practicing psychological safety, curiosity, and divergent thinking, that's what it takes to do the same type of thinking as the genius is, and then do genius thinking ourselves.
Oh, really, really great. David, thank you so much for spending your time with us this morning. We are so grateful.
I appreciate it. This is always fun for me to talk about.
Well, clearly you're passionate about the topic. And so I've got a couple other questions that I want to ask you. One of them is, so we are talking and we're engaging in ways that people can reach out to you and perhaps benefit from your workshops or your coaching or your training, even through your Clear Next Step platform. Can you share with us a little bit about what one of those workshops or programs might look like, what someone might be able to expect if they were to engage you as a coach or a trainer?
Absolutely. So one I'm developing right now is there's a 6-week creativity boot camp, which is just 1-hour sessions, one a week for 6 weeks. And we kind of break down these skills, and we give you exercises and things to think about, and then homework where you're asked to practice these in your daily life. And then we'll talk about that the next week. And we have kind of ways of measuring our creative thinking before and after, and we'll look for growth. But then also we would have a half day or a full day session on this creativity formula and what it looks like, what our exercises we can do, how can we communicate with each other within the context of the creativity formula. A lot of games too during this to teach us what creative thinking looks like and reflection questions based on that. So that'd be a half day or full day workshop. I just taught a 2-day class on creative thinking, all virtually. So that certainly is possible. I'm looking forward to being able to do these things in person again too.
Nice. I'm thinking about some of the other coaches that we've engaged recently, and we've got ideas about laughter and what laughter can do for team building and for energy and for our physical wellness as well as our emotional wellness. And we're talking about creative thinking and unlocking our genius. We've got all these examples of having fun again at work, which
Exactly.
I know after these long 22 weeks or so have been less fun for many of us, but I know we're all looking forward to having fun again. So thank you. And it with practical, with the examples that you've shared today, just some practical, bottom line results, even while having fun.
Exactly. Yeah, and if you want to find those resources, and I do a weekly blog post too, I try to keep it very practical, creativedave.net. So I found if I do daviddubchak.net, people aren't going to remember that. So creativedave.net.
Creativedave.net. That's awesome. Yeah. This is the Even Better podcast. And as we wrap up today, one of my questions for you, David, is what's making you even better right now?
Well, what I try to do is read outside of my area of expertise. That's one of the things I talked about with the curiosity part of the creativity formula, but read outside my area of expertise. So I subscribe to a couple different magazines and journals, Smithsonian Magazine, Harvard Business Review, things like that. And I try to focus on articles that I don't know anything about. And read one just the other day on teaching language to apes, right? And just, I find these things fascinating, and someday I'll be able to make a connection between that and a problem I'm working on.
Outstanding. Outstanding. David, thank you so much for your time today. Thanks for being part of this conversation. And we look forward to continuing in further conversations in the future.
All right. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
And to all of our listeners today, thank you for joining us on the Even Better podcast. And on behalf of all of us here at Your Clear Next Step, we're wishing you a wonderful day.
Thank you for tuning in today. The Even Better podcast will be back with more content soon. But in the meantime, subscribe to our podcast or check out our website at yourclearnextstep.com for more information. See you next episode.